Good morning. Welcome to the third and final day of our program on legal issues faced by threatened island nations. It's become very clear throughout the course of the conference that the first priority of the nations that are threatened by sea level rise is for their populations to be able to stay there. That's where their property is, that's where their heritage is, their cultures, and so they would like to stay there as long as possible, preferably forever. We're going to be focusing this morning on adaptation options, on what can be done in order to prolong the ability of the people in these countries to stay where they are. We're going to be hearing from two people from Columbia University who are going to talk about, in an overall sense, what are the nature of adaptation options. We'll start with Klaus Jacob, who is a geophysicist here at Columbia University, who in recent years has been doing a great deal of work on disaster risk management. And Dr. Jacob will be talking about issues relating to that and what are the nature of the risks that are posed by sea level rise and some of the engineering and physical challenges. And Aaron Coughlin, who recently completed a degree program in climate and society here at Columbia University, is going to be reporting on the results of a team of which he was a member on the overall menu of adaptation options that have been proposed and developed around the world for this kind of situation. Then we will hear from two people who are based in the Marshall Islands, who will be able to talk about how some of these engineering options might actually work in the Marshall Islands, and also what are the challenges, what's known about physical conditions specifically in the Marshall Islands. And much of that will also be relevant to other areas, but we thought we would have that focus. So Albin Ashoda is the executive director of the Marshall Islands Conservation Society, one of the leading NGOs, and he has years of experience relating to these issues in the Marshall Islands. Murray Ford is a coastal geologist with the University of Hawaii, but he is based in Majuro, and so far as I can tell, knows more than any other living person about the actual data and what's actually happening in the Marshall Islands. But before we have these talks, we're honored to have with us Mr. Jusub Joseph Lee, who is Senior Program Manager at the Global Strategy Unit of the Global Green Growth Institute of the Republic of Korea. So Mr. Lee, whose organization is one of the co-sponsors of this program, is going to talk a little bit about his organization and give us his perspective.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me, giving me a chance to speak here and talking about these important and the urgent issues. Well, I don't think there's many people here who much know about our institute. So I'd like to just briefly introduce my Global Green Growth Institute, which is established just last year. And my colleague from our institute will have a more detailed introduction with the next session. So green growth issue is a kind of a new concept, a new paradigm, based on the comment of Nicholas Stern. We have right now the current world has two difficult and most important challenges right now. One is the overcoming poverty, The other one is kind of managing these climate issues. If we fail to achieve one of these two issues, we fail both of them. So we think that the growth as a tool for recovery, overcoming the poverty, but in this kind of new world, the managing and mitigating the climate change is also very important issues. So we think that these two issues are not a different one, not a separate one. It should be linked. So that's our basic kind of concept of green growth. So actually, this kind of concept is based on the Korea's experience of last over than 60 years. The last 60 years, Korea is very, in some sense, successful. Korea is one of the only one country who changed their status as a recipient country to the donor country more than a matter of several decades. And our in 1960s, our country's per capita GDP is less than $60, but nowadays per capita GDP is more than $20,000. So major chip makers and shipbuilders and the automakers are also from Korea. But when we're looking back, our country's experience of economic growth, this thing is going to be, these things also cannot be applicable in the 21st century, because last year we, based on the kind of quantitative, in some sense, kinds of more like, in some sense, imbalance, in some sense, there's a lack of sustainability. So we think that we should change our kinds of paradigm of growth to the more new paradigm or new concept of the world. So our institute, based on that experience, and we want to disseminate the those kinds of successful cases or some new ideas to the developing and developed world as well. So we try to find out more kinds of how to change our energy schemes to more fit to new climate change issues, and how to mitigate our system to more to sustainable development. So we now try to we have some projects in the Kazakhstan and the Indonesia, Brazil, and Ethiopia to setting up the green growth plan, which is based on the how to government-led kinds of strategy to induce growth of those countries, but more like to applicable to this kinds of new concept of green growth. So, but in case of Marshall Island, in case of threatened island nations, we think that the green growth is their problem is beyond the green growth issue. It's a kind of a survival of their country and survival of their kind of identity. So we happily sponsor these important issues. And during the last 2 days discussion, we find out a lot of interesting new ideas and concepts of and the legal approach. But today's session, I think that we have some kinds of base on the. We will try to focus on the how to do it right now, how to mitigate these urgent issues, and how to what to do and how to find out what the real problem is. So I really anticipated I think this is a very important stepping stone to way forward, look forward to the new kinds of new how to adapt or how to dealing with the new challenges for us all. So in this climate change world, we are all connected. So the problem of threatened island nations issues is not the not only their issues. We are all connected. So that's our issues for all of us. So I really anticipated this session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Here we go, and I'm now pleased to call on Dr. Klaus Jacob.
Thank you, Michael. Being a non-lawyer in the room, I will slightly have a different approach to things, and I beg your forgiveness for that, but there is a world out there that we have to live with. So the question that I ask, if it is not forever, how long and at what costs will one of the islands, in this case Majuro, in the Republic of Marshall Islands, be sustainable? And what tools do we have available to make some estimates? Now, it will come out at the end with some estimates, but please don't take those for granted. It's only the methodology that I want to really present here. The data need to be collected, refined, and serious work will have to be done. But at least I wanted to show a principle that can be useful in the context of thinking about adaptation and where maybe its limits. We have seen on the first day by Elena Carr a overview of sea level rise. This is the slide here that shows from about 1200 to the present, and here start the data to come in about sea level rise. These are inferred from indirect data. Tide gauges start, in the late 1800s. And we are here, and then there are the projections originally in 2007 by IPCC. This is 1 meter of sea level rise. And then there are the updates, which show in the order of 1 meter plus minus. But the world doesn't end in 2100 just because the IPCC made this its target. Life goes on, and sea level will rise. And again, Elena Carr showed us that the problem lies not in the Marshall Islands. It lies by our own doing in Greenland and Antarctica. And if this ice is being warmed up by the atmosphere, it melts. And here you have a plot over the next 1,000 years. When the atmosphere goes by 3 degrees C, it rises with that speed up to 1 meter. And if it goes by 8 degrees C, it goes faster. And that is without any accelerating ice dynamics. That means how the water on the bottom of the ice sheet accelerates the ice flow. This is just a thermal effect. So if all of Greenland goes, it's 6 to 7 meters, and here are some of the other numbers which we should not contemplate because even Greenland is doing the trick on us. So what is the situation in Majuro? I have here a long list of the island properties that are of interest in a risk approach context, and here are some of the data about the sea that are important to know. But I simply focus here on the red one highlighted, which show that the natural elevations of the island are somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 meter above what is still defined there as mean sea level, which is really mean sea level of 1968, 69 as a reference point. There's about 10 centimeters since then that sea level has risen already. The reef growth is important. because if that stops, certainly that will accelerate the demise of any islands that would be inhabitable. There's a lagoon that's 70 meter deep, and so on. I just want to point out here that the tides on the seaside, and the lagoon, of course, are about 1.2 meters above mean sea level, and they go roughly the same below mean sea level at low tides. There are winds. This is an interesting one here, the interannual changes, El Nino and La Nina, that again Erna Carr elaborated on. They're important because when there's an El Nino year, there are more storms. It's also drier, so there are potential for more droughts. And the La Nina years have, of course, the opposite. And then there are normal years in between. So current sea level is about 3.2 millimeters from tide gauges and 4 millimeters per year from satellites, so about the same type of order, which is not that much more than global average, actually. We are expected about 1 meter and plus minus, and we heard all sorts of boundaries by the end of the century. And the sea levels and the tides together then would be in the order of 2.2 meters if we stick with this 1 meter right now as a working hypothesis. And I'm not forecasting here, I just want to have a working hypothesis so we have a target with which we can do work here. So what are the stressors that exist or will be amplified in the future? We, of course, have a population on the islands. They need water, they need food, energy, transport, waste treatment, health, and, of course, a livelihood. And there are hazards that come from climate change, the variations in precipitation that can cause drought, sea level rise with combinations of surges from storms, steady state inundation and related saltwater intrusion, and not to forget the ocean warming, acidification that was elaborated again on the first day about coral bleaching. But for the rest of the talk, I will really focus only on one aspect, that sea level rise in combination with storm surges, as an example how one would go about. When I mean by risk-based approaches to planning, we better understand how we define or can define risk. For the purpose of this talk, I'll use a very simplified version as interesting. The product of three factors, namely the hazards, that would be what Mother Nature provides, of course, with our help, the assets that are exposed to those hazards, that's both lives and the built environment, and their vulnerability for the types of assets, and they are a function of the hazards. The higher the hazard, the higher the vulnerability. It's actually a dimensionless value between 0 and 1. 0, nothing happens if the hazard is coming about, and it's 1, it's all gone. The total replacement value is gone, or the life is gone. So there are dimensions, the assets, you can measure it in dollars or your preferred currency. The hazards would be normally a probability per year. But that probability can be 1 if you have a scenario event. So if you have a scenario event, the probability is simply 1, and the hazard maybe storm height or wind speed, would simply show up in the vulnerability, because that goes up to whatever level this example was. So this form of defining risk, has some interesting implications that we will elaborate, but we need to assess quantitatively the hazards, namely sea level rise, the frequency of storms, the frequency and height of waves, the flooding that relates to that, and so on. But as I said, we will focus now largely on the inundation and flood events that will be the example. Before I get to them, I want to point out, however, there are sort of certain implications coming out of this definition of risk. Namely, mitigation, as climate folks call it, namely the reduction of emissions and therefore not that much warming, would directly modify the hazard, even so by sea level rise with substantial delay by hundreds of years. But that's the only factor that modifies the risk here. You can argue about it. We have to change our assets, our cars and the rest of it to reduce that. So there's actually some connection here, but for this purpose we can ignore it. Since we are dealing here with adaptation, we look at the combination of hazards and assets. That's called land use. Namely, where you place your assets with respect to the hazard, that's a planning land use issue. It needs also on coastal areas a consensus in terms of coastal management. It may involve some actions to actually move some of the assets to safer place, either laterally or vertically. And so on. You can use seawalls that actually modify the hazards, but I will come back to that, and I have some question mark because they have a limited lifetime. There are always social justice and equity issues when you build seawalls, for instance. Who pays for it and who gets the benefit? Only the people directly near the wall or also on the other end of the island? The other combination that can be looked at is the products of assets times vulnerability. And that's good engineering, construction codes, quality control. You can raise the asset in place and reduce its vulnerability. So that's what the engineering world would deal with. So this is an interesting thing because it sort of allows you to factorialize, if you like, the various policies that you have at your hand to play in order to minimize risk. And that's our goal. Now, one of the assets, of course, is population. And here's the plot since 1850 of Mangroves. And, you know, something happened around the 1950s. And the question is, you know, if that would be a natural event, you would say, wow. But it was not a natural event. It was essentially socially engineered. And it is a fact now that we have to live, and it is your life. You are in there. But it poses a risk. If the assets go up, we have more risk. So now let me come more to the actual flooding hazards from storms, waves, sea level rise. I will not touch on tsunamis, and flooding will be, of course, overriding. So in order to understand how flooding occurs, we first need to know the elevation, the grade elevation of the ground on the island. And unfortunately, there is no easily available survey of the topography, or what folks call the digital elevation models, or DEM, available. And that's clearly something that I think ought to be produced for the future in order to get a better handle on risk and risk management. But here these numbers show you the grade level for a couple of points that came about when the Australian government put a tight gauge in, I think it was in 92 or 93, and they made a survey. And here you see elevations of about 1.7, 1.8, and so on, all below 2 meters above mean sea level. That's an important point to keep in mind. Now, there was a paper published in a paper. It was a long study, actually. I thought a pretty good study that NOAA did for the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and came out in '97, and it studied many of the risks and possible options for Majuro. It looked at 4 particular study areas. I will only use the DUD area, Jared Uliga Delap area, in study area 1. While I'm carrying some numbers around for the others, we will ignore them eventually. So here are some numbers that this study quoted, and that's a little bit confusing, so let me guide you through this. These are numbers for the ocean side and for the lagoon side in the various studies areas. So let's look at only study area 1, which is in red in meters, and all they worked in feet, so I have to live with that. Here are feet of the critical beach crest on the ocean side, on the critical beach crest on the lagoon side. So they are in the order of 2.3, and on the lagoon side actually lower, 1.7, because it has a lower dynamics when the waves act there. So now they are looking at the flooding frequency and the number of events per year. Now 130 means simply it occurs once in 30 years, once in every 5 years, and 10 times per year. For 0 sea level rise, 1 foot, 0.3 meters sea level rise, and 1 meter sea level rise. If you take the ratio between the 1 meter sea level rise and the 0 current sea level, it's a factor 300 in terms of the frequency of inundation. On the lagoon side, it's somewhat lower according to their calculations. Now, I took those numbers and modified them. Now I forgot how to move it. Boy. Oh, yeah. And I plotted up the surge elevation versus the frequency of occurrence, and these are the frequencies at the probabilities, annual probabilities, versus the elevation. So this is a rare event with higher surge, and these are the more frequent, common events at lower surge heights. The important thing is there is the lagoon beach crest elevation that we mentioned before, and the ocean beach crest elevation. The normal astronomical tides without weather is about 1.2, 1.3 meters, and buildings seem to start somewhere around just below, and roads just below 2 meters. Now that's for current sea level, and look what happens when sea level occurs, where those curves shift. here we go. I go back and forth because those things stay fixed to the land and the buildings stay fixed to the land, but the water goes. Okay? So you see how the frequency shifts to higher values at a given level. For instance, if I'm here, now the frequency has shifted. Now I can turn around the coordinates, which we need to do for risk analysis, and I flip them, and now the world looks like this. We have the probability of something occurring on the vertical axis and the amplitude of surges on the right axis. We now have three curves only, namely, this is the lagoon, oops. Yeah, this is the lagoon curve. This is the ocean side on current sea level, and this is the ocean side with 1 meter sea level. And you see how the probability increases at a given surge height, the frequency. Now, why is that of consequence? Because when we plug that information into our risk equation, then that's one of the factors. But these are not the only phenomenon occur. I had to make modifications because the tides occur twice a day over the year, and they have a range of amplitudes. And if sea level rises, those stay with the sea level, so they simply shift to the right here with the same frequency. And then there's another phenomena that I haven't yet talked about. These are the storms, cyclones or typhoons, and they have another distribution, and I didn't have any data, so I just made a broad band that covers any likely data, but I have not taken them yet into account in the subsequent computations. So at high sea level, 1 meters, you would have a hazards curve, namely the probability versus the magnitude of surge, and this curve would be the one that applies at current sea level. So now let's look at loss projections in our adaptations option. That's, of course, the airport with some seawall and recent flooding event, and this is an option how one may go about dealing with. And there are essentially two approaches. You can make loss estimates for particular events that you can simulate and compare to the actual occurrences, or you take the annualized flood losses as a function of sea level rise, by which you add up all the contributions from the smallest to the biggest storms, divide them by their recurrence period, and add them all up, integrate them up, and then you get their contribution on an annualized basis. So the scenario example here would be what happened the other day. It was December 15, 2008, in which reportedly 1.5 million loss was occurring, but it was by all means a semi-modest kind of flooding event compared to what can occur. So now let me quickly go through the principle. Here is the frequency curve that I showed in principle before, even so it looked a little bit more ragged. And here is now the vulnerability. They're all working on the same coordinate x, which is the sea level height. And what happens is that a building that stays at a certain height doesn't get any damage as long as the water is below that sea level, but of course it gets damaged as the water rises, and then there's probably some remnant value that still stays even after flood is receded. Now, if that's the annualized hazard curve, we have to multiply those with each other and then add up, integrate. And what you get then is sort of a contribution that looks like that yellow thing here. And you see that the biggest contributions come actually from the many small events, not the rare big events. The rare big events may be the ultimate disaster, but your losses that you incur come from the many small events, and you pay constantly in fixing up the problem, so you get into the spiral of poverty where you spend your resources on fixing these frequent small problems instead of developing your own livelihood. When we do that, we have certain options available. Aha, time is running. We have options available. For instance, here I can change the vulnerability by putting a seawall in. So it's 0 until I get there. And then when it starts to overtop, I follow the original curve. The problem is, once I overtop a seawall and there are structures behind it, they retroactively get flooded. So that's what I would call the sort of New Orleans effect, where you think you are safe, but you're not. So now we proceed and exclude the typhoons, and here are some simple bare numbers for various assumptions of vulnerability, but given those curves. And they're very sobering. The lagoon side has percentage of assets, annualized percentage of losses. That is to say, if this were a number 1, like 1.8%, I lose 1.8% of the assets in 1 year. Okay? Now you see, let's ignore the lagoon side. Let's go here for brevity. Between current sea level and 1 meter sea level. These are huge factors here, more than 500 or something like that. Okay, well, no, 250. But you can even lose more than 100% in 1 year if you build very low on very low elevation, 1.5 meters. How do you do that? Well, you quickly rebuild, after the first loss in the year, and you do that 5 times over in the year, and you lose 540%. Okay, that's not how reality would work, but numerically, that's how it comes out. It just shows you what you would have to deal with. So the message to be taken home here is that the increase of losses for 1 meter of sea level rise is by many hundred times. So the question is, how can a society internally and how can the world outside that island society cope with that situation? Well, what are the results of this exercise? For 1 meter sea level rise, we have annual losses that are 10 to 100% of the asset values. For the initial cost of every 1 kilometer of seawall, which I found out from a proposal is about 10 million per kilometer, you could actually raise 500 to 1,000 buildings, if 1 to 2 meters, if you assume these kinds of cost per structure. Yeah? That's an average. There may be big structures and there are small structures. So you have to think about what is more suitable. If you have a seawall, you may protect to some degree the infrastructure. If you only raise the buildings, the infrastructure is, of course, still a problem. I've not accounted for here for typhoons and cyclones like in 1905 or 1918. And that means that the true disaster is probably not from the distant storms and wave actions and swells, but ultimately the fate of the islands could be sealed if one of those events would recur. As in historic times, it already had. So my suggestion is that roughly for about 0.3 to 0.5 meters sea level rise, the costs will be so horrendous that I think the only option is to reduce, not entirely move, reduce the population density on Majuro, keep a remnant population on the island, which I would sort of call the stewards or stakeholders, literally just putting a stake in the ground and stay there. So, and in 1,000 years, sea level again goes down because we followed our green advice that we just heard, and it will take at least that long before it goes down. Then you folks can come back. Indications, and that's the last slide. So flood damages associated with economic losses can be forecast as a function of sea level rise with these kind of methods. The costs versus benefits can be also looked at by modifying your vulnerability by raising or seawalls or whatever. The model losses and flood mitigation costs can be used for estimating compensation claims, which sooner or later you have in mind, and you have to put a dollar value to that. And it can be done for future losses by using those sea level rise scenarios, maybe even the storm scenarios. The timing of when permanent evacuation of the majority of population will become urgent and or cost beneficial can be estimated as a function of various temporal sea level rise scenarios. But if you want to use that method, then you have to have certain information, because someone will want to have a certification of your modeling procedure and input data if it's being used in a formal way for compensation claims. So someone will have to certify that these claims are based on substance. And in order to do that, you will need certain data that right now are not as sufficiently available as one would like. I say here on the bottom, potential race against time, because that sea level rise is coming. And sometimes when I sit here and think about treaties that you negotiate, and you think sometimes I think in decades before something from the start to the finish comes through, there can a lot of things happen. So race against time, and that's what it sums up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacob. Now, Aaron Coughlin.
So the aim of this project was essentially to identify a variety of adaptation strategies that have been listed and used throughout the world for coastal and island adaptation to climate change. And so this research I'm presenting was compiled by Caitlin Butler, Miriam Hariri, and I. And so... Okay, so to contextualize our talk in sort of a legal discourse, we wanted to point out some of the debates that have been happening over the last few days that have implications for adaptation into the future. So in terms of a population nucleus or stewards that are going to be remaining in threatened island nations, you can imagine that adaptation measures are going to be critical to allow these people to stay in their homeland. In addition, there is debate about compensation for adaptation, or compensation for climate change, and the funds of which would probably go to adaptation, and so measures are likely to be necessary to enable this to happen. In addition, migration yesterday was discussed as a possible adaptation strategy, so we'll contextualize this here in this talk, but it's something to consider. So the first thing that we had to think about when we started looking into adaptation in small island states was what exactly people are going to be adapting to, and what will adaptation mean for people possibly in the Marshall Islands and elsewhere. So one of the first considerations we had to take into account was that we're not just looking at climate change. So climate change here would be represented by this trend of rainfall moving either to an increase of 20% or a decrease in 20%, both of which are listed in the IPCC as possibilities for the Marshall Islands region. But it's not only climate change that people are going to have to deal with, but also this variability around this trend. So you can see these are two El Nino events that caused major droughts in the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And so no matter where your trend ends up, this variability is also going to be very important to keep in mind in terms of adaptation strategies. So conventionally, adaptation to coastal change is categorized into three different categories. The first is to protect against a coastal change, such that if the sea level does rise, it won't affect your habitation. The second is to accommodate your living situation, such that when the coastal change and the sea level rise does happen, you will be safe from this type of change. And the third is to retreat, the extent of which can be debated, but essentially to remove yourself from the vulnerable situation. Our approach, given these traditional considerations, is to advocate for an integrated approach of protection, accommodation, and retreat measures, such that they can work together synergistically and we can concentrate on this overlap in the middle, so that when adaptation is implemented, it can draw on a variety of different options that could be classified in each of these three ways. On top of this, we looked at three different scales at which adaptation could be implemented in the Marshall Islands, for example. We started with the national level at a sort of what could the government and the nation of the Marshall Islands do to adapt to climate change, and then we moved to the regional level, which would essentially refer to an atoll, and what could people at that level do to adapt to climate change, and then we moved to the household level. So what can one household on one plot of land consider in their day-to-day decisions about how to adapt to climate change. So these are all driven by policy decisions. That's what this graphic is trying to represent. And so moving forward with that, I'm going to list here essentially a menu of adaptation options that we've identified that have been used elsewhere around the world. And so our criteria for selecting these to present today essentially began with selecting strategies that responded to both sea level rise and to rainfall, or to rainfall, I should say. And there are a huge variety of these in the literature. So we also looked at strategies that would respond to climate change and climate variability. And then we narrowed it even further to adaptation strategies that are place-specific and potentially applicable in low-lying islands and other coastal areas. So here, this is a sort of a key for the rest of the presentation. We intended to give a relative cost based on back-of-the-envelope calculations such that the order of magnitude of the cost of the materials for each one of these projects could be represented and compared to each other. And so this is something to consider for the rest of the presentation, but it is a back-of-the-envelope calculation and would depend on how much you scale up any one of these projects. So starting at the national level, we identified a number of adaptation options. And so adaptation options to protect against climate change are often seawalls, as Klaus mentioned, and beach nourishment. So here you can see the design of a seawall that's been proposed for Madro, and this is beach nourishment that's happening in the Netherlands, in which you take sand from the ocean and you deposit it on beaches that could be eroded. And so the problem with these measures, although there are a lot of engineers who know how to implement them, is that they need to be studied very carefully for implementation in an atoll context because they could have a net negative effect if they do increase erosion on the island. Another protection strategy are natural barriers to climate change, including coral reef transplantation and structural aids. So these have been implemented, for example, in Thailand in the wake of the tsunami to help increase the viability of the coral reef and its movement upwards with climate change. In terms of accommodating climate change at the national level, one of the one of the things we identified in the literature is something called adaptive management. So if the national government implements, for example, here a national climate change plan, it enables the government to move forward and respond to change as it happens and integrate a variety of local approaches such that if the rainfall does move up or down, everyone is prepared to respond and can move forward in an adaptive manner. Oh, and an example here that you can see, this picture of the Remind plan, is an example from the Marshall Islands directly and will be explained by Alban Ashoda next. In terms of relocating at the national level, here we're looking at resettlement and migration. And so this was discussed extensively yesterday, and essentially there are a number of pros and cons. And while this is a contentious issue, it could help relieve some of the population pressure. So moving from the national to the regional level, we start again with protection options. So here at the regional level, it's really the responsibility of the islanders to maintain some of the larger scale protection measures that might be implemented by the national government. So if seawalls are not maintained, they could actually cause erosion into the future, and if people build right up to the seawall and then it erodes, you might actually increase your vulnerability to climate change. Vegetation interventions have actually been used around the world to help stabilize shorelines and increase sediment accretion. And so here you can see the pandanus plant that's been used in the Marshall Islands on the left. And what's interesting about this plant is it also produces an edible fruit that can help contribute to food security in the islands. On the right, you see mangroves that have been used successfully in Cambodia and Indonesia and also in Fiji. In terms of accommodating climate change at the regional level, we looked into large-scale options for water storage at the regional level. So here is a novel idea of a water bladder that is used by the U.S. Navy and can be a possibility for offshore water storage, and because it floats in seawater, it can actually possibly be more resilient if there is a flood. So desalination plants are talked about around the world. The Middle East relies on these heavily, and the Marshall Islands do have several reverse osmosis plants right now. So some of the considerations for this example is that they do require quite a bit of energy, and they do require a good deal of capacity to maintain and to keep these plants ready for emergencies, at which time they could be very useful for supplementing the local water availability. So here's a sort of a slide on how to accommodate climate change in terms of capacity building, and Alban, again, will touch on this a little bit later. Another option for water supply in the Marshall Islands is groundwater. There is a small freshwater lens that's held in the soil of the atoll, and it varies in size depending on the atoll. Each atoll is different, but in places like Majuro where this does exist, there is a certain type of technology that can be very helpful. So when you want to pump groundwater, and if you dig a vertical pump, you might end up pulling seawater up from the bottom and actually salinating your lens. And so this type of technology could help the lens be sustainable into the future because it pumps horizontally at the top of the lens and just lifts the water from the top and doesn't risk saltwater intrusion up from the bottom. This is called a gallery pump. In addition, community shelters can be very useful in times of emergency, such as typhoons and tsunamis and any other emergency on the island. And so this is a picture of the Assumption School on Majuro, which has been built, elevated, and has been used in times of stress for people to come and congregate there. So in terms of relocating at the regional level, this is a fairly small-scale example, but this is the island of Majuro, and traditionally people lived on the leeward side of the island. And because of the non-natural population change that happened in this century, people have now started creating large population densities on the windward side of the island. So this makes people more vulnerable to storm surges and to typhoons and things like that will actually start by reaching the windward side of the island. So in the future, if you're contemplating where to put a population nucleus or where should people stay in the future, it might be advisable to locate on the leeward side of the island. Moving from the regional to the household level, there are a number of actions that can be taken at the individual household level to adapt to climate change. And so we begin again with protection. Vegetation interventions, similar to mangroves, can be helpful in stabilizing soil in front of one's home. So if you live on the beach, we came across a product that's been used in the United States in Utah called slope growth. So this is a picture of it in action, and it essentially combines nutrients with local seeds to help them take and really be viable in areas that otherwise would not have grown large plant populations. And so this can kind of help stabilize the soil in front of one's own home. So if you know that there's going to be a storm surge, and if you have an idea of how high that storm surge could possibly be, it could also make sense to waterproof your home. So there are a number of products available on the market for this, such as sealants and waterproof membranes that can be used to basically reduce the infiltration of water into your home and reduce the flood damage that you could see in the future. FEMA advocates for this here, and there's a company in the Philippines called Durotech Philippines that provides these products also. In contrast, in a more accommodation idea for adaptation at the household level, you can see something called wet waterproofing. And so this would include putting the house on stilts or even providing openings or breakaway wall sections to allow the water to pass through and not actually cause flood damage in your home. This is actually required by law in some places of the coastal United States. So in terms of a more large investment at the household level, we've looked into a few different types of novel home designs that are more resilient to sea level rise. And so you can see here on the right, there's a picture of what is actually a floating home. It's anchored on moorings, and if storm surges come or king tides, perhaps, the house will float on its moorings. And on the left, you can see a house that's not only on stilts, but actually is resistant to 75-mile-per-hour winds. This house is prefabricated in the United States by a company called the Ullman Studio, and they're actually in dialogue with the Maldives about its potential applicability in an island setting. In terms of the household resilience into the future, we looked at a couple options such as hydroponics, which you can see an example of here on the right, which could contribute to household food security because it does not require extensive amounts of land. Instead, it only requires water and energy inputs to grow a number of different types of food in the home. On the left, you can see a biogas plant. So waste collection and waste treatment is actually a problem in a number of Pacific islands. And so this is an example of a way where people can actually convert household waste into energy and increase the energy security of their house. This has been used successfully in Nepal, India, and Rwanda. In terms of household water security, you can see that this picture on the right is a picture of a rainwater catchment system in a house that exists on the Marshall Island. A number of houses already have these types of systems, and so if this could be scaled up more to other homes, it has the potential to increase potable water security, especially if this is a picture of a UV sterilization unit. And so if this is combined with the household water catchment and storage system, it can increase the potable water supply and reduce the impact of disease. In terms of relocating at the household level, this is actually a little bit more of a complicated idea, especially if the population density is as high as it is on Majuro. But essentially, if you have a small plot of land, you could choose to build your home away from storm surge areas. And so this is basically a simple solution that could be implemented and discussed by any family. So in conclusion, bringing back our hybrid approach slide, we would like to advocate for this sort of synergistic approach that merges protection, accommodation, and retreat measures. And so an example of this is the Remind plan that's going to be presented by Alban Ashoda. And so it's important to consider that these ideas have been used around the world, and we're not advocating that every single one of these ideas would be applicable in the Marshall Islands or in any other country. And Alban is going to speak about how you would actually make that decision and how you could actually put these ideas into practice. Thank you.
Did you have slides? This one? Yeah, here we go. Mr. Ashoda.
Thank you. Yahweh. Good morning to everyone. I'm very happy to be here presenting on behalf of my partners back home. So, but the presentation I'll be presenting will be on the softer approach to adaptation. And this will be done in the context of the Remalak National Conservation Plan. Remalak, which literally translates to looking to the future. So, although my name is up there, I'm not the only one who is working on this process. I have many government and non-government, other non-government partners that are with me that we work together to do this type of work with our communities. So without further ado, a wise man once said that litigation is about telling stories. I'm not going to be able to tell stories this morning. One, because I'm not a wise man. The second one is because, as Klaus found out, I have such a limited time. Oh, this one. And I'm technologically challenged. So, how do we do this?
Why don't you just a second there? Okay, and you can use this clicker. Just click on the right.
On the right?
Yeah, on the right.
Please don't take 1 minute away. Joking aside, I think perhaps part of my talk will be shedding some light into the complexity of the climate issue, especially from the lens of communities, but one especially that is culturally based and has been in existence or aligned itself in its daily existence to its thousands-year-old culture. So, my presentation will be talking about one of many adaptation strategies, but one that I've been basically involved with, and that is the approach to adaptation through biodiversity conservation and sustainable resource management. This specifically aims at maintaining healthy ecosystems to allow natural processes to build atoll resiliencies to impacts from climate change. It should be noted, however, that this ultimately requires us to exclusively work with communities as resource users and custodians across the Marshall Islands through this established process, again called the Remalak, looking to the future. But before I go on, a couple of points I'd like to mention. Number one is there is a great challenge in enabling and empowering communities. And I'll give you an example. If you, throughout the 3 days, have found most of the language being used to describe climate change, such as adaptation, mitigation, and we're all students, lawyers, and scholars, and imagine trying to translate that into a local context. That is one of the most difficult things to do, and that is one of the challenging things that we have to deal with, trying to bring the information down to the community level. The second challenge we find is that fundings and technical assistance are not as available as it sounds. Or if they are available, then they are usually dictated by donors, some of which may not necessarily be in the best interest of a collective national approach to address climate change issues. So, although I might add that our government partners have been quite effective in trying to streamline development partners' assistance towards more useful goals, such as adaptation through water security and mitigation through energy security. The third point I want to add before I get specific into the process is that social implications from impacts from climate change haven't been fully understood. So one of my greatest fears is that the world or the international community continues to avoid the real human and social impacts that this crisis will potentially have on the most vulnerable amongst us. This is not a political statement, I'm sorry. This is just, I'm just trying to put some of the challenges up so it's easier for us to understand. I'm trying to put the human face to climate change. Of course, we still need to understand that there are other local stressors, and this is where this process comes into play. Addressing other stressors, what I would like to call the non-climate stressors, that may potentially accelerate and perhaps magnify these impacts should we fail to understand and address them at the local or national jurisdiction. And finally, there is no one-size-fits-all. Even within the country, one community has different specific needs than another community. And I'm not really going to that because I'm sure the next presentation will cover some of that. But initially, the Remalak process was developed to address biodiversity conservation in the Marshall Islands through a comprehensive consultation process that involves the resource users, the resource owners, and the custodians that are determined by our culture. So the process is based out of an eight steps that allows us to continuously consult with local communities on how to develop resource management strategies to help them protect their corals, sustain their livelihoods, sustain their food securities. But while we were developing this, we realized that one of the greatest threats outside of their own stressors was climate change. So we had to, at some point, climatize, for lack of a better word, the process. So we had to look at climate change events that may potentially lead to the destruction or to the suffering of the communities in the Marshall Islands. So how did we do this? Well, we had to understand the social vulnerability. My two previous presenters were presenting on the physical vulnerability and adaptation towards those. But my presentation is going to focus mainly on the social vulnerabilities and how we did that. So we have to look at socioeconomic. What are some of the baseline tools and impacts to livelihood and lifestyle? The level of understanding and concern, and how do we engage the different stakeholders within each communities, not just at the local level, but also at the national level. So we have to look at traditional knowledge. Sometimes we underestimate the importance and the validity that traditional knowledges bring to these processes. So we had to go back, ask questions. What were the past events? How did we deal with these events? To be able to understand how we can mobilize a community from a cultural context to address future events with support from, of course, other physical adaptation. And we had to also assess the ongoing biophysical environment to understand what type of habitats or what type of biological, biophysical elements are available to protect communities or continue to build atolls resiliencies to these impacts. So this is an example of one of the projects that that is taking place now, and this map basically represents the other end of Midway Atoll. This is the village of Rida within the DUD district that was alluded to earlier. So what this map represents are houses where people have little to no access to clean water or access to water, period. So, in retrospect, if these changes continue to happen, then these are some of the most vulnerable people that we have to find ways to help cope with these changes. And this is basically to help us inform our government, inform our partners on potential opportunities and avenues to address the most vulnerable amongst the communities there. Again, this is another slide of the same area that depicts areas where there were extreme or some damages from the recent storm or flooding events in 2008. So in the red zones, those were some of the houses that were affected. So by understanding these, we're able to understand amongst the communities which are the more vulnerable, and how do we continue to deal with them at the same time, continue to help force or help influence policies to look at other areas that are potentially as vulnerable. And finally, one of the initiatives that the government is part of is called the Micronesia Challenge, and it's in that area within the globe, the yellow border, and it represents 5 jurisdictions, 2 U.S. territories, Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, and 3 freely associated states government, the government of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and Republic of Palau, in a very ambitious initiative to conserve 30% of nearshore marine resources and 20% of terrestrial resources across Micronesia by 2020. Again, this is only one of many adaptation strategies that are on the table and are being pursued by partners within the Marshall Islands and by partners within the region. Yeah, that's it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now Dr. Murray Ford.
Good morning, everyone. I'm a coastal scientist by trade, and I've been living in the Marshall Islands for the last couple of years. And I spent 4+ years looking down a microscope at sand, and have now kind of dawned on me that many people actually live on this pile of sand, which forms an atoll island. And I guess it's one of the key things that probably hasn't been mentioned yet through this conference, and something that I'm always stressing in whatever work I'm doing, is that atoll islands are directly connected to the reef. They're entirely comprised of material that was once living on the reef. So when we think about islands, we need to be thinking in a system attached to the reef. When we talk about ocean acidification, that's impacting the reef, which in turn affects the delivery of sediment to the island. So we need to take the systems approach and think of it entirely. One thing that we've been talking a lot about this week is the atoll nations, and that's the Marshall Islands, the Maldives, Tuvalu, and Kiribati. And I put a star next to Kiribati. They're the one member of the League of Atoll Nations, which actually has a slightly higher island, a raised coral island covered in phosphate. But I think we'll give them entry into the Atoll Nations Club and exclude that one island. And so what we're doing, and what we've been doing in this conference so far, is we've been treating these islands, these countries, as relatively homogeneous, and we've been putting them in a basket and kind of considering them the same features. And I didn't really think of the visual symbolism of the basket when I put this slide together, but I guess we're treating them as basket cases, on a trajectory to ultimate doom. And so this is a statement you'll read everywhere. I start every grant proposal with this sentence. Atoll islands are widely considered to be amongst the most vulnerable landforms on Earth with respect to the impacts of sea level rise. I don't need to remind you guys of that. And so because we take this approach of lumping these atoll nations together and saying they're vulnerable, we also take that approach on a national scale. And we say that Namaruk, Madro, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, we say they're all the same. And we throw them in the basket and we say all these atolls are the same. They're all doomed and they're all going to be equally affected in the same manner by the impacts of sea level rise. So this current approach treats atolls as homogeneous, and it often ignores the vulnerability on a national, atoll, and importantly, an island scale. Because in reality, people live on islands. They don't live in countries. They live on an island surrounded by a reef. So we've seen this map a few times, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. So we've got 34 islands, 34 atolls in the Marshall Islands. 29 are pure, true atolls with a central lagoon, and 5 are mid-ocean reef islands. The islands are geologically young. This is quite an interesting thought that the pyramids in Egypt were built before these islands emerged, before the reef was broken down into sand and washed into place and vegetated. So these islands are geologically very young features. And we've been quite lucky in the Marshalls in the fact that we've had a very good sea level record dating back to 1968. And the long-term trend is about 3 millimetres a year, which, as we've heard, is around about the global trend. Interestingly, sea level is highly variable due to the El Nino southern oscillation. And you can see there 2 or possibly 3 significant monthly drops in sea level. 1997 was the most recent, and as some of the more aged Marshallese in the audience might remember, that was also associated with a significant drought. This was one of the most significant El Nino events in the Marshall Islands. Now recently, this graph stops probably December 2010. In February of this year, we're in a relatively strong La Nina phase, and the sea level was about 6 centimetres higher in February than it had ever been before, which was quite significant and caused quite a lot of local impacts, significant flooding on a number of islands. So as I mentioned about this idea of treating atolls as homogeneous landforms, we're assessing vulnerability in a number of case studies in order to kind of tease apart that local variability in the vulnerability of atoll islands to sea level rise. A lot of this work tags on to the work that Albon and the Romanlock team is undertaking. The Marshall Islands are a logistically very difficult place to work, so you've really got to be opportunistic if you want to get to the outer islands. So one of the interesting aspects is this divide between urban and rural islands. Virtually every talk on the vulnerability of atolls is dealing with the Madros, the Tarawas, Funafutis, the Malays of the world, when in reality there are 20,000 plus atoll islands sitting on top of 500 plus atolls. So there's only a very small number of urban islands which contain the bulk of the population, economic activity, political power. So the outer island work is often undertaken as part of capacity building exercise with the government and NGO members, as well as the local community. I'd like to stress that a lot of this work is relatively straightforward, and ultimately, it's my goal to render myself unemployed in this work by providing that capacity for it to be undertaken locally. And I think as members of the climate change community, it's important to stress that we should be always striving to build that capacity and render ourselves unemployed. So this was a project funded by the Asia Pacific Network, led by the University of Auckland, by Paul Kench and his team down there. And we visited one atoll and one mid-ocean reef island, Jabbit, which is a small island, and Island Lap Lap, which is one of the most beautiful atolls I've ever been to. And we worked in 2 different villages there for about 4 or 5 days in each village. So as you can see, Jabbit is a mid-ocean reef island surrounded by water many kilometres deep. Has a population, relatively low population. Some people were telling us 40 people were on the island, and then we got invited to a wedding, and I counted at least 60. And that wasn't counting the children, so I suspect somewhere 60 to 100 people. We didn't herd everyone to one end, so we didn't count them. Has no lagoon. It has no functioning airport. You can see on that satellite image there is a former runway there, which is now overgrown. I believe it was too short and dangerous for the plane to attempt landing. So our approach was basically to first map all the village assets, so things like houses, the local swamp which is used for the production of taro, as well as wells and other infrastructure that was important to the community. Then importantly, we surveyed the elevation of these assets relative to sea level. Basic level surveying, really simple stuff. We trained the local community, a couple of the young guys, on how to use these tools, and a lot of the islands we actually leave some of the tools and expertise behind so they can use them in the future. So basically we take slices through the island and we measure how high they are. It's not rocket science, it's not technically very advanced work. It's a machete and a lot of mosquito bites, and eventually you end up with this really good picture of the island topography. And so from that we can then flood the island, and we can throw various sea level rise projections, and we can see how vulnerable that island is to the impacts of sea level rise. Now interestingly, in Jabbit, all contemporary structures are elevated well above projected sea level rise, including a storm run-up component. Now Jabbit's quite a high island relative to a lot of atoll islands. So we visited an island about 10 miles away on the atoll of Island Lap Lap. And this is a village called Jay, another beautiful island, pristine, nice lagoon, very nice place to visit and work. It's only about 10 miles from Jabbit. You can actually see them from each other. Has a deep lagoon and an airport, so it's a much more accessible location. It's easier to get to. And again, we mapped the assets of the village, the houses, schools, wells, etc. And again, we surveyed them relative to sea level. And we found that over 90% of structures would be flooded by a half-metre increase in sea level. So this is quite concerning when you have 2 villages so close and yet so different in terms of their vulnerability profile. And yet again, we've been considering atoll islands as homogeneous and equally vulnerable to the impacts of sea level. So it's a really important piece of work that needs to be done in order to allocate resources for hazard mitigation and climate adaptation. As it stands presently, adaptation money goes to atolls with the loudest voice, atolls that are easiest to get to. It's not necessarily allocated based on need. And that's really important on this national scale, that we can assess the vulnerability locally and allocate resources accordingly. So from the outer islands we visit Madro, which, as you've seen in many pictures, is an urban atoll. And this is a study of shoreline change between 1967 and 2006. Now Madro is fortunate in the fact that it's politically a strategic atoll. So it's had a lot of aerial photos taken over the years during the US, I was going to say occupation, but that's not the right word, while the Americans were in charge. And so here we have 1967, and for those of you familiar with Madro, that's Dalip, that's where the capital is, it's where the supermarket is, the hospital, and it's actually where the major airport was in 1967. So we just trace the outline of the shoreline in each aerial photo, and we go through and we do it for each year. Here we're seeing 1983, which was actually while they were constructing the large international airport, so that airport became a road. Eventually we get through to 2006, and we have a map with all the shorelines, and we can start assessing some of those changes. So that was just an example from Dalip, which is in the eastern or urban part of Madro. Here's a really nice little example of how much the shoreline has changed through man-made processes of reclamation, causeway building, etc. So in 1970, Barakan and Madro looked like this, and today we've added all that additional land. And that land was added as a result of landfill. It was used as a solid waste site and then eventually rehabilitated into land which is used for light industrial, commercial and residential purposes. So we found in Madro that the shoreline in the urban area accreted in over 70% of the shoreline. And I use the word accreted. Accretion seems to imply a natural process, which it certainly isn't. It's a man-made process of building seawalls and building out onto the reef flat. And we saw about 30% of the shoreline eroding, which again is probably a function of a lot of anthropogenic activity within the coastal zone. So the net result was the urban area of Madros increased by 67 hectares. Again, from landfill, causeway, reclamation on both sides. So within the urban area of Madro, there are very few unconsolidated shorelines. There's no beaches. It's largely all protected. Some on a well-organised, well-planned approach. Others on an ad hoc landowner, individual house title approach. So Madro is interesting in the fact that we basically can divide the island in two. We have an urban area and a rural area. The rural area is largely unconsolidated shoreline, lots of nice sandy beaches, a lower population density with minimal coastal development. And we found that roughly 50% of the lagoon shoreline was eroding and about 50% was accreting. So the net result, the lagoon shoreline, relatively stable over the study period. Whereas the ocean shoreline showed about 30% erosion and about 70% accretion. So the net result was these rural villages over the study period were slightly larger than at the beginning, and the changes were small. So I'd stress that stability would be the overall outcome for the rural area, and which tend to be focused in the western area. This is where the groundwater resources are. It's where most of the agriculture takes place on the island. It's a small example which I put in here for anyone who's been to Madro. I'm sure you've gone to the picnic spot at the end of Laura, which is actually eroded about 60 to 70 metres and narrow, and so it's come in about 60 to 70 metres, but actually got wider in certain parts. So we've got to kind of consider this constant readjustment of the island and the changes within the coastal zone. So this I just put in last night after thinking about the number of times we've heard about 1 to 2 metre of sea level rise. And it's obvious that sea level is going to be higher than the current AR4 projections of 59 centimetres. And I pose a few problems with this to some of the legal profession, and probably not necessarily relevant for the Marshall Islands, which hasn't got a planning procedure which adopts a sea level rise target. But we're constantly presenting the community and the planning community in the Marshall Islands with all these different targets of what sea level is going to do over the next 89 years. And so this is something that perhaps we need to clarify the message, whether it's 59 centimetres, 100 centimetres, 200 centimetres. It's very hard for our planning folks to set these planning targets in place when we have these multiple targets which are often moving. And so I wonder if there are legal implications of setting a national sea level rise target for planning purposes that differs from the IPCC projections. And I have no idea on that, and I'll leave that for you guys to discuss. So we have an issue with using this magical year of 2100 and whether it's a locally appropriate year to use as a sea level rise planning target. There's little or no infrastructure within Madro that is planned to last until 2100. So we need to establish locally appropriate targets for adaptation planning. So 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, so that we can take an infrastructure project and say, well, this road is due to last 15 years. This is the sea level we should be planning for. And I also think it's an appropriate time to mention that donors have a responsibility to consider building to a higher sea level when funding projects. Now, we often get projects funded in the Marshall Islands that are funded and built to contemporary conditions, when personally I believe the donors have some responsibility to adequately fund the project so it can be built in order to adapt to a higher sea level condition. So there's currently, I was going to show a quick video here, but I'll get through that. Oh, okay. Oh. This is just a classic example of, maybe it's gone. Oh, that's wildlife in HD. That's certainly not it. It's a video of the airport in Madro and a recent road that was constructed. I'll describe what the video showed using words, the power of words. And this road already floods now. And so this was a road that was funded out of the US. And if it floods now under contemporary conditions, that's only going to increase with sea level rise. So in reality, the donor should have funded the road at a higher cost and built that road to resist some of the sea level rise. So I did some quick, relatively back-of-the-envelope type calculations looking at how often that road would flood as a result of sea level rise. So right now it floods about 1% of the year, and I just threw a basic number of scenarios of sea level rise at that road, and you can see that with just a modest 40 centimetres of sea level rise, that road would be underwater about 10% of the time. Now eventually, with 1 metre of sea level rise, which is a reasonable target to plan towards, we're looking at 60% of the time that road's underwater. Now, personally, I believe that that's a function of poor design, poor planning, and probably poor funding, which resulted in a road being built which wasn't adequate for neither contemporary conditions nor future conditions. So a few final discussion questions. Sea level rise in Madro and also in Ebi, which sadly we haven't spoken about, is largely an engineering problem now. For the large part, these islands are man-made features. Madro, the urban area, is entirely devoid of natural beaches which adjust to the changing of physical conditions, and as such should be treated as an engineering concern, which is the opposite of the outer islands where they're natural, more pristine, and adjust accordingly. So currently we have technical and financial mechanisms in place which can greatly alter the shape of the island, largely for profit. So landowners can reclaim land, build a house, rent it out, and make profit. So we need to, just some pictures of other reclaimed land from around the world, which is technically feasible. And a question I pose is, can mechanisms be put in place which place a value on reducing on increasing elevation in order to decrease vulnerability. So right now we can build more land to make profit, but can we, either through the free market or through regulation, incorporate mechanisms which can build safer land, build higher rather than wider? And that's something that certainly needs to be discussed as an adaptation option for the marshals. And we still have many questions. The ultimate, there are still many scientific questions about what is going to happen to atoll islands. It's not case closed on a simple turn the tap on and the island will flood. Obviously the impacts will be severe, but we don't know what's going to happen to reef flat waves and hydrodynamics, currents around the islands. We don't know what's going to happen to the health of the reef. We know that the reef and the island are so intertwined and interconnected. Ocean acidification is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Is that going to cause a massive cessation of reef growth? What's going to happen to the generation of sand? These islands are made of sand. We need a reef that can continually supply and deliver material to island shorelines. What's going to happen to sediment transport? What is the reef's response to sea level rise? And more importantly, in the urban areas, what are the man-made responses? So, you know, we're dealing with long-term sea level rise, and we're dealing with people that every year are making decisions about how to protect their household and their infrastructure. So there are so many questions about what's going to happen. I was going to say between now and 2100, but it's what happens tomorrow, it's what happens the day after, it's what happens in 5, 10, 15, 50, 500 years, if 500 years is a possibility, within these areas. So in conclusion, I think we really need to take these islands and these countries out of the basket. Doesn't mean they're not necessarily basket cases, and look at these atolls individually. I think they deserve to be treated as individual islands sitting on top of individual atolls with individual issues unique to their situation. So obviously sea level rise will have a huge impact on the long-term habitability of many islands in the RMI, but vulnerability varies at a local scale and needs to be assessed accordingly. The big question is, how will the islands respond as geological landforms? And more importantly, how will the islanders respond? Thank you.
Thank you very much for several very interesting presentations. We now have about 20 minutes for questions, comments. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Paul Powers. I'm from the Thomas M. Cooley Law School. I'd like to thank the panel for their discussion today. My comment is towards Aaron's presentation. I'm really excited to hear that you added mangroves to the presentation. Right now I'm a current law student, but prior to law school I served in Senegal, West Africa for the Peace Corps, and one of my projects was had to do with mangroves. One of the great things about mangroves is that not only does it trap sediment, but it sequesters 50% more carbon than any tropical forest out there. So it's a really great thing to combat climate change and emissions. There was an excellent report done in 2006 by the IUCN called the Managing Mangroves for Resilience to Climate Change. I implore anyone to take a look at that article. It talks a lot about the benefits, even on low-lying islands, on the benefits of mangroves. There was also a study in 1989 in Western Jamaica that rather to sustain the rate of sedimentation and versus the sea level rise, they actually combated sea level rise from the sedimentation that was gathered by the mangroves. So that was a very successful project in Western Jamaica. One thing that the islanders should know is that even if sea level rises do increase substantially, mangroves are not implanted within the ground. Their root systems are on top of the sand, and so with sea level rise, mangroves move. So if sea levels rise, the mangrove will move with sea level. And so it will protect against hurricanes and natural disasters. And it's a great way to protect your agriculture from flooding, from the hurricanes, all of those little things. And with the sediments that do capture onto the mangroves, because they do move, those mangroves will move in the opposite towards the ocean as well. So think of like high-rise, low-rise. Every time there's a high-rise, sand will be trapped on the roots and create land. So essentially, mangroves create land. So your islands will get bigger just as long as the rate of sea level rise isn't greater. So it could be a possible way to combat actual sea level rise. With 1 to 2 meters, I mean, that's going to be a really huge problem. But like I said, it does move, and so it will still protect your agriculture within land. So I do implore you to look into some sort of organic seawall as in the mangroves. And that's really all I have to say about that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Fred Muller, Marshall Islands, and I'd like to follow up on the gentleman on my left and was mentioning about mangrove. But let me say a first point also. By the way, thank you for the very informative presentation. For Aaron, for Madro, if you're going to think about leeward side to move the houses, people's houses, you're going to do that. It's highly populated. But you could do that in the other islands. But as Marie was saying, it's different cases. For mangroves, that is, I understand that it's in the Raymond project also with Audubon. It's an initiative, and I know in Kiribati they are planting a lot of mangroves in Kiribati, and that is an option. In Madro alone, because of urbanization, those mangroves are gone. So again, it's to protect, in the other islands, as well as maybe plant some, on Madro. Just a thought. Thank you.
Okay.
Aloha. Good morning. My name is Deanna Spooner. I'm with the Pacific Islands Climate Change Cooperative based in Honolulu, Hawaii. And I wanted to pick up on a couple of points for folks to keep in mind as the discussion moves forward. Several of the panelists emphasized two things that have really been lacking from the discussion the past couple of days, and that is climate variability and that the norm is changing. Climate variability, according to the climatologists in the Pacific Islands, is what is going to really threaten island nations in the short term. Sea level rise over the long term will swamp out many other climate impacts, but climate variability has destructive power to destroy coastal communities with extreme events. But also, as was mentioned earlier, the norm is changing. And so the other events that are happening that are not termed extreme events, such as winter storms or other storm events that are causing coastal inundation and erosion, those events are becoming more severe, and they're not getting as much attention because they're not the typhoons. But just for one example, this year, Midway Atoll in the northwest Hawaiian Islands experienced 3 extreme events, only one of which was widely reported. The first 2 were winter storms. They were not atypical winter storms, but the damage that was caused was atypical. There was infrastructure damage. There was loss of seawalls. There was loss of buildings. There was loss of docks. Structures that had been in place, had been built during World War II, that had survived decades of winter storms, were washed away. And then because of the rubble that was created by these 2 winter storms, when the tsunami hit a month after the second winter storm, the subsequent damage from the tsunami was not just due to the wave overwash, but to the detritus that was washed up from the winter storms. So there was subsequent damage from the tsunami wave overwash. And luckily there was no loss of human life, but those 3 events in total killed 100,000 nesting birds. So those events are becoming more frequent, and we're seeing them in communities throughout the Hawaiian Islands, and they're not as widely reported because it is a normal winter event on top of sea level rise, on top of, say, a high tide or a king tide. It's the culmination of all those events that are really causing damages to the local communities, whereas in the long term, the 1 to 2 meter of sea level rise will, sort of finish off local communities. But in the meantime, when we have discussions about treaties or regional agreements, we need to be thinking about what kind of short-term and immediate action communities need to adapt to these more regular occurrences. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name's Katie Ullman. I'm actually an undergraduate at Vanderbilt University, so I'm not coming from a place of great academic expertise, but more one of concern and interest. I wanted to kind of respond to and ask a question off of Dr. Ford's question about how the people will be reacting to some of the solutions that we're talking about. I'll be going to the Marshall Islands this summer working with Albone and hopefully a group of students about climate change education and activism. And I think these forums are absolutely crucial in terms of the sound science and creative solutions that have come up. And my concern is more about how those people will react and kind of asking Dr. Ford and Albone, and as well as the government officials of the Marshall Islands, if it would be realistic to put out the best policies for adaptation, relocation, even legal action, and put it to a vote of the people, or if that's just a crazy idea. But in terms of what ways we could get feedback from the people of the Marshall Islands.
Would any of you like
I'm not going to comment on that. That's a decision, for the Marshallese people to make. It's up to the scientific community to provide as much information as possible and put it in a format as accessible as possible, and then let the Marshallese people through their government make those decisions.
Let me just take a crack at that. I think the reality now is that climate change, relocation, is not being discussed at the community level. Because people, number one, don't want to move, they don't see themselves as Marshallese once they leave their homelands. And the other one is, and this is where we try to come in, is to try and build communities' capacity to be able to address these issues on their own through soft approach, say mangrove, whether it's mangrove, or reconnecting with their traditional sense of resource use to continue to provide that natural resilience or processes to build these communities' resilience naturally to climate change. In terms of I guess part of the reason why we wanted to do the presentation is to show the world that we're not just talking about this at the UN level or at the international level. We're trying to empower communities to make their own decisions, whether they choose to migrate or not. But at that time, it's up to them. So I guess my point is that it's going to be quite difficult because the discussion is not really about relocation. It's not really that happening, especially with the communities that I work with.
Caitlin?
Hi, my name is Caitlin Butler. This is actually directed towards Alban again, and it's a follow-up question to your great question. But in the past 3 days, the issue of traditional forms of land use and land planning has been brought up. And a lot of the adaptation strategies that come up, especially the visioning ones, have to deal with manipulating that land, moving people in certain ways, the Western term being zoning the land. How do you feel is the most appropriate way to approach these rather difficult decisions within an appropriate context for the Marshall Islanders, specifically language that could be used to discuss these complex issues?
Thank you for that. That's a good question. I guess part of what I failed to express in my presentation is the intricate link that our culture has on our land. And I think rightly so, because the ambassador and our other government leaders and people have continuously mentioned the fact that land is perhaps the most valuable possession to a Marshallese. So zonation will require a lot of consultation with the different landowners. I mean, even relocating from a vulnerable site inland will require a lot of consultation and compromise from the different landowners, not because they don't want to, but because they have their own families, growing families, who will also need to benefit or have access to that specific plot of land. So because it's really 181 square kilometers, that's the total land mass for the Marshall Islands, for 60,000 plus people. That is why in our culture, it is perhaps the most valuable possession to the Marshallese. So zonation is always a good idea. I mean, we encourage these type of discussion, but it's not as easy as it sounds. It's not a, like a square, something that you can just plug it in and make it happen. It requires a lot more than just that.
Well, so hello, Miguel Esteban from Waseda University in Japan. Okay, over this conference, many people haven't mentioned the fact that these islands in the past have actually moved up and down together with sea level rise or decrease. And although we're assuming that at some point in the future the corals will stop being thriving and will die, at the moment there's a lot of corals which are still providing material to these islands. So some of the presenters today have placed some line of the islands and have imposed the sea level rise on the current level, but have ignored the fact that to some extent these islands will probably continue to grow, at least for some time. So would anybody want to comment on?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's actually one of the big research questions that the earth science and geology community working on atolls need to continue working on. The response of the reef to sea level rise, and therefore the response of the island. The recent work that I think Jane mentioned yesterday about the number of atolls islands which have got larger. We still don't have a good handle on how the islands themselves as geological features respond to sea level rise. What's increasingly apparent is they're not, it's not the Statue of Liberty and you're just going to gradually flood it. The island itself responds back to sea level rise. So some islands have been shown to get higher, some have been shown to get narrower and higher. So these are all interesting questions from a geological point of view. The problem from a geological point of view is that people live on these islands. And so when you hear the term islands are sinking, islands are drowning, that's probably not necessarily true. It's the people and the infrastructure and the assets and their culture that drown. Islands themselves may or may not persist as geological features, and that's a really important question that needs attention from the research community.
I want to add something to that. Over the last 16,000 years, sea level rose by roughly, give and take, 100 meters, with rates that are they're very similar and sometimes larger than what we are looking at for the next few hundred years, in excess of 1 meter per century, as the water that was during the glacial times up on Canada and Scandinavia went back into the ocean. And those islands just did fine. They just kept up because A, there were no people, B, the oceans were colder and didn't threaten the life of the corals, and C, there was low acidity of the ocean. But with these three stresses, we kill the goose that lays the golden egg, which is the corals and the sand. So it's this triple stress that comes from the outside in two factors, acidity and temperature, and internally the population stress that doesn't look good for those atolls, particularly if they're high population, to make it through those 1 meter per century type of rates. And that's why I say you have to reduce the density of those islands, and even then you don't have the guarantee because of the temperature and acidity aspect.
We now have a break coming up. I want to thank our panelists for a very interesting discussion. And we'll resume in 15 minutes.